Howdy, folks, and welcome back to Grit and Gunsmoke. The West was full of legends, most of them about men with fast guns and hard reputations. But the deadliest shadows are often cast by those the world tries to erase. Before we ride down this long, dusty trail of vengeance, do an old storyteller a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single bullet from this tale. Now, pour yourself a stiff one and listen close. This is the story of a woman they branded an outlaw's accomplice, and the hell she raised to clear her name. This is the last trail of Clara Dawson. The woman who called herself Clay was a whisper in the New Mexico territory. To the few who could afford her services, she was the best trail guide this side of the Rio Grande. A woman who could read the desert like a book and navigate by the stars as if she'd placed them there herself. She was lean and weathered, her skin the color of tan leather, her sun-bleached hair usually hidden under a dusty, wide-brimmed hat. But it was her eyes that people remembered, the color of a pale, winter sky. They held a stillness, a cold, watchful calm that promised no comfort and tolerated no fools. She was a woman who had made a covenant with the harshness of the land, and in return, it had kept her secrets. Her latest secret was the town of Redemption. Tucked away in a high desert valley, Redemption was a place people came to be forgotten. It was a handful of adobe buildings, a single dusty street, a saloon that served warm beer, and a general store that was always low on something. It was perfect. Here, she was not a legend, not a ghost, not even a woman. Really. She was just Clay, the quiet guide who kept to herself, her past a locked room no one in town had the inclination to open. But the past was not a room. It was a ghost that rode at her shoulder, a constant companion on the long, lonely trails. Its name was Luke Dawson. Luke had been her husband, an outlaw whose name was once a legend. He was a paradox of a man, a thief with a gentleman's smile, a killer with a code of honor. He robbed from the railroad barons and the mining conglomerates, never from the common folk. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of charisma and danger, and Clara had loved him with a fierceness that defied law and logic. Their life had been one of hidden camps, of nights under the stars, of a dangerous, wild freedom. That freedom had ended in a hail of bullets in a box canyon near the border. It was an ambush, run by the one man Luke had trusted as a brother, Silas the Viper Kane. Kane wanted Luke's reputation, his network, and the location of a hidden stash from a legendary train robbery. The fight was short and brutal. Clara remembered the scent of gunpowder, the scream of wounded horses, and Luke's last, desperate words to her as he pushed her toward a hidden ravine. "Run, Clara. Just run." She had run. And Kane, having killed the legend, did something crueler. He didn't want the law hunting him for Luke's murder, so he created a new villain. His surviving men told the U.S. Marshals that Clara Dawson had been the true mastermind, the cold, ambitious schemer who had set up her own husband to take his score and his place. Overnight, her name became a curse. Wanted posters with a crude and flattering sketch of her face appeared in every town from Santa Fe to Tucson. The outlaw widow, they called her, an accomplice, a murderess. She had lost not only her husband but her name, her past, and her future, all stolen by the lies of a snake. So she had died. Clara Dawson, the loving wife, the spirited partner, vanished. In her place, Clay was born a survivor, a ghost who traded in trails, not memories. This fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday. Clay rode into Redemption, her latest job done, the pay in her pocket. The town's usual sleepy quiet was gone. In its place was a tense, brittle silence. The air was thick with a fear she recognized all too well. Standing in front of the saloon were 5 men who did not belong. They were hard-faced and wore their guns with an easy, predatory arrogance. Their leader, a big, bearded man with eyes like chips of obsidian, had his boots up on the sheriff's desk inside, visible through the window. The sheriff himself, a timid man named Peters, was standing by the bar, wringing his hands. Clay dismounted in front of the livery, her own cold peacemaker a familiar, heavy weight on her hip. "Newcomers?" she asked the stable boy, her voice a low, quiet rasp. "The Blackwood gang," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "Rode in this morning." The leader, Jed Blackwood, he told Sheriff Peters that the town's water rights now belong to him. Said anyone who disagrees can talk to his gun. Clara's blood ran cold. This was how it started. A slow, strangling vine of violence and intimidation. Her first instinct, the one that had kept her alive for 5 years, screamed at her ride. Disappear. This is not your fight. She was turning to do just that when the saloon door swung open. Blackwood and 2 of his men swaggered out. They stopped, their eyes falling on the blacksmith, Mr. Gable, who was crossing the street with his young daughter, a girl of about 8 with ribbons in her hair. Well now, Blackwood drawled, his eyes fixing on the girl with a greasy leer. That's a pretty little flower for such a dusty garden. Maybe your pa can pay his new water tax some other way. Mr. Gable, a decent, hard-working man, stepped in front of his child, his face pale but his eyes defiant. You leave her be, Blackwood. Your business is with me. Blackwood laughed. Brave words, Smithy. He backhanded the man across the face, a casual, contemptuous blow that sent him stumbling to the ground. The little girl screamed. Something inside Clara snapped. The carefully constructed walls between Clay the survivor and Clara the widow crumbled into dust. In the terrified face of that little girl, she saw the reflection of her own stolen future, the family she and Luke would never have. She saw the same brutal, lawless power that had destroyed her life now preparing to devour this small, fragile town. Her promise to herself to survive, to remain a ghost, was a promise of cowardice. Luke had lived by a code. He fought for the underdog. He had died because of a betrayal. What was the point of her survival if all she did was run while the same kind of snakes preyed on the innocent? Justice isn't given, it's claimed. The thought was a whisper that grew into a roar in her mind. She was not a hero. She was not a lawwoman. But she was a Dawson. And the one thing Luke had taught her, the one thing Silas Kane's betrayal had burned into her soul, was that you do not let the wolves win. Jed Blackwood, still laughing, turned his attention back to the crying girl. But his laughter died in his throat. Standing 20 yards away, near the livery, was the quiet trail guide Clay. Only she wasn't standing like a guide anymore. Her hat was pushed back slightly, revealing the cold, pale fire in her eyes. Her duster was swept back from her hip, her hand hovering inches from the worn, walnut grip of her Colt. She was no longer a whisper. She was a thunderclap waiting to happen. Blackwood, she said, and her voice was no longer the quiet rasp of Clay. It was the clear, steady voice of Clara Dawson, a voice that carried the weight of 5 years of loss and rage. You heard the man. Your business is with him. Blackwood and his men turned, stunned by the audacity. He looked at this slim, dusty woman, and he saw no threat. He saw meal. Well, he sneered. Looks like the town's got a little filly with some spirit. You got a name, little filly. Clara's hand did not move. Her eyes did not blink. I do, she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. And it's the last name you'll ever learn. The fragile piece of redemption was over. The ghost was done running. And the outlaw widow was about to start her last trail, not as a fugitive, but as a reckoning. Clara Dawson's retreat was not an act of fear. It was a strategic melt into the landscape. The moment she had locked eyes with Jed Blackwood and delivered her cold promise, she had become a ghost once more, slipping between the adobe buildings and vanishing into the familiar, embracing wilderness of the high desert before his stunned men could even clear their holsters. She left behind a town buzzing with a terrified, electric energy and a gang leader who had been publicly challenged and made to look a fool. She knew she couldn't win a stand-up gunfight in the middle of the street against 5 men. That was Luke's way of grand gestures and impossible odds. But Luke was dead. Her way was the way of the serpent, silent, patient, and deadly. Her war would be fought not with loud explosions of violence, but with the slow, creeping poison of fear and strategy. From a hidden crevice high in the red rock hills overlooking Redemption, she watched. For 2 days, she became a part of the landscape, her world shrinking to the movements of the Blackwood gang. Blackwood, enraged and humiliated, had put the town on lockdown. His men were a constant, swaggering presence, harassing the townspeople, searching homes, their frustration growing with every passing hour that the phantom woman remained unseen. They were lions pacing in a cage they thought they controlled, unaware that the cage itself was the trap. Clara's first objective was to undermine their most critical resource, their control over the town's water. The main well in the center of the plaza was their throne, the source of their power. To deny them that was to deny them their crown. She remembered the old stories, the tales the Apache and the early prospectors told. Stories of hidden springs and forgotten oases. She had spent years mapping this territory in her mind, not as a place of towns and trails, but as a living entity of rock, water, and shadow. That night, she moved. She was a wraith under a sky littered with a million cold, diamond-like stars. She traveled for hours, following a dry, ancient riverbed, her instincts guiding her. She found it just before dawn, tucked away in a small, box canyon, hidden behind a curtain of overgrown willow trees, a small, clear spring, bubbling up from the earth. It was weak, choked with years of neglect and debris. She spent the entire day working with a fierce, determined energy. Using her hands and a flat, sharp rock as a spade, she cleared the mud and stones, deepened the channel, and coaxed the weak trickle of water into a steady, reliable flow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was life. She returned to the outskirts of Redemption that night and sought out her first potential ally, the stable boy, a skinny, sharp-eyed youth named Finn who the Blackwoods treated with particular contempt. She appeared before him in the stables, the ghost materializing from the hayloft. The boy was terrified, but his fear was outweighed by a deep, simmering resentment for the town's tormentors. "They control the well," Clara said, her voice a low whisper. "But they don't control the mountain." She gave him simple, clear directions to the spring. "Tell the people, only the ones you trust. Go at night. Leave no tracks." The boy stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. He nodded, a single, jerky motion. The first seed of rebellion had been planted. With the town's water supply now secretly supplemented, Clara turned her attention to the gang's mobility. Their horses were their lifeblood, the source of their speed and their power. She began a silent, one-woman campaign of sabotage. She would sneak into the livery at night, a phantom moving between the sleeping animals. She used tricks Luke had taught her, tricks of the outlaw trade. She would place a small, sharp pebble deep inside a horse's hoof, a stone bruise that would make the animal go lame within a day but would appear to be a natural injury. She would mix a small amount of loco weed into their oat supply, enough to make the animals skittish, unpredictable, and difficult to control. Within a week, the Blackwood gang was dealing with a string of bad luck. Their horses were going lame. Their patrols were slowed. Their confidence was being eroded by 1,000 small, inexplicable cuts. They were masters of brutal, overt violence, but they were utterly unprepared for this kind of subtle, creeping warfare. Blackwood's frustration mounted. He needed a victory, a way to reassert his dominance. He chose the weakest link in his own chain, a young, boastful outlaw named Dusty who spent more time bragging in the saloon than watching his back. Blackwood sent him out on a solo patrol, a pointless show of force to intimidate the surrounding area. For Clara, it was a gift. She stalked Dusty through the desert, a patient, silent predator. She didn't reveal herself. She simply herded him, using the terrain to subtly guide him deeper and deeper into a remote, maze-like series of canyons. Finally, when he was miles from any help, hot, thirsty, and utterly lost, she made her move. A single, well-placed shot from her rifle, fired from a high-unseen ridge, kicked his canteen from his hand, the precious water exploding into a cloud of steam on the hot rocks. A second shot tore the reins from his grasp. A third sent his hat flying from his head. Dusty, screaming in terror, threw his gun down and fell to his knees, his hands raised in surrender to an enemy he couldn't even see. Clara emerged from the rocks, her Colt held steady. She was no longer a ghost. She was a judge, and court was in session. "Please," the young outlaw whimpered, his face a mask of tears and dust. "I ain't done nothing." "You ride with Blackwood," Clara said, her voice echoing in the canyon. "That's enough." She disarmed him, her movements swift and efficient. She was not there to kill him. He was too valuable for that. He was a messenger. She tied his hands and interrogated him, her cold and wavering gaze stripping away his bravado, leaving only his fear. He told her everything. He confirmed the gang was hired by a railroad baron to secure the valley. He told her about their numbers, their ammunition supplies, their plans. He was a font of information, and he gave it all up freely in a desperate bid to save his own miserable life. When she was done, she left him there, tied and helpless, just as she had Hank Miller in another story, in another life. But she knew he would be found by his own men eventually. She was sending him back as a carrier of a contagion far more potent than any bullet, the contagion of absolute terror. He would tell them that the ghost was real, that she could strike from anywhere, that she was always watching. Clara had provided water to the thirsty and had taken it from her enemies. She had crippled their horses and broken their nerve. The serpent in the dust had made its first moves, and the Blackwood gang was beginning to understand that they were not dealing with a lone, frightened woman. They were dealing with a force of nature, as patient and as unforgiving as the desert itself. The return of the outlaw Dusty, half mad with thirst and babbling about a ghost who shot the hat from his head and the water from his hand, did exactly what Clara had intended. The story spread through the Blackwood gang like a fever, infecting them with a deep and corrosive paranoia. Their bravado in the saloon was replaced by tense, watchful silence. They started at shadows. Every gust of wind sounded like a rifle shot. Jed Blackwood was furious. His authority was being systematically dismantled by an enemy he couldn't see, an enemy his men were now convinced was a supernatural specter. He knew he needed to reassert his dominance, to prove that he was still the most dangerous wolf in the valley. He needed a public display of force, a kill that would send a clear and brutal message. He chose his target, Lefty Pete, his second in command. Not to kill him, but to send him out as a hunter. Lefty Pete was a different breed from the rest of the gang. He was not a simple brute. He was a cold, methodical killer. A man who had earned his nickname after losing 2 fingers on his right hand in a knife fight and retraining himself to become an uncannily accurate shot with his left. He was a man who trusted only his own skills and his own instincts. "This ain't no ghost," Lefty snarled at Blackwood in the saloon. "It's just one person, one woman. I'll go out, I'll cut her trail, and I'll bring you back her scalp." Clara, learning of this from a coded message left by the stable boy Finn, knew that this would be her first true test. Lefty was not a boastful fool like Dusty. He was a professional. He was a hunter. Outthinking him would require more than simple tricks. It would require a deep, intimate understanding of her opponent's mind. She knew Lefty was a trapper, a man who supplemented his income by running a line of snares in a series of remote canyons to the north. It was a habit, a routine. And routine, Clara knew, was a vulnerability that could be exploited. She decided to turn his own hunting ground into his tomb. She rode out the night before, her movements cloaked by a darkness so complete it felt like a physical blanket. She traveled to the canyons where Lefty ran his traps. She did not disturb them. Instead, she studied the area with a strategist's eye, reading the terrain, choosing her ground. She found the perfect spot, a narrow, winding section of the canyon with a high, rocky ridge on one side and a steep drop-off on the other. It was a natural kill box. She spent the hours before dawn preparing her ambush. This was not just about finding a good hiding spot. It was about creating a narrative of death. She used her knife to make a series of subtle marks on the trail, a broken branch here, an overturned rock there, signs that would be invisible to an amateur but would scream ambush to an experienced tracker like Lefty. She wanted him to know he was walking into a trap. She wanted him to be on edge, his confidence replaced by caution. Then, she took her primary position, not on the high ridge with obvious sniper's perch but in a small, deep crevice on the low side of the trail. A spot almost completely concealed by shadow and scrub brush. It offered a less commanding view, but it was the last place he would expect a shot to come from. Lefty Pete rode into the canyon just after sunrise, his rifle held ready across his saddle. Clara watched as he immediately spotted the signs she had left. He dismounted, his eyes scanning the high ridge, his body tense. He was good. He knew he was being hunted. He left his horse and began to move forward on foot, using the rocks for cover, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on the high ground where he expected the threat to be. He was so focused on the obvious danger above that he never saw the real danger at his own level. Clara waited. Her breathing was slow and even, her heart a steady, cold drum. She let him move past her position. She let him get to the center of the kill box. She waited until his back was partially turned as he scanned the ridge one last time. Then she rose from her crevice, a silent, sudden specter of death. "Looking for me, Lefty," she called out, her voice clear and calm. He spun, his face a mask of shocked surprise. He had been completely outmaneuvered. He was a master of the hunt, and he had just realized, in the last second of his life, that he was the prey. He tried to bring his rifle around, his left-handed skill a blur of motion. But Clara was already firing. Her shot was not rushed. It was the culmination of 1,000 hours of practice, 1,000 rounds fired in the high lonesome of the mountains. The bullet struck Lefty Pete squarely in the chest, the impact throwing him backward against the canyon wall. He slid to the ground, a look of profound, final surprise on his face. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara stood over the body of the man who had come to kill her. This was the first time she had taken a life since her transformation. She felt no remorse, no triumph, only a grim, cold finality. This was the cost of justice. She did not leave the body for the buzzards. She had one last message to send. From her saddlebag, she took a short length of rope. With practiced, nimble fingers, she tied a complex, distinctive knot, a series of interlocking loops that was both elegant and strong. It was the widow's knot, a signature Luke had used, a way of signing his work that was known and feared throughout the old outlaw territories. She left Lefty Pete's body propped against the rock wall, his own rifle across his lap, and the widow's knot hanging from the barrel, a clear and undeniable statement. The discovery of the body sent a new and far more specific kind of terror through the underworld. The random killings could have been anyone, but the widow's knot, that was a signature. It meant that a legend, a ghost from the territory's bloody past, had returned. The law wouldn't understand its significance, but every outlaw, every gunslinger, every man living on the wrong side of the law would hear the story and feel a cold chill. Clara Dawson had not just killed a man. She had reclaimed a piece of her past, twisted it, and turned it into a weapon. The first bullet had been cast, and its shadow was long and dark. The outlaw widow was no longer just a name on a wanted poster. She was a legend reborn. The widow's knot was a declaration of war written in a language the town of Redemption could not read, but Jed Blackwood and his men understood it perfectly. The story of Lefty Pete's death, and the iconic outlaw signature left at the scene, spread through the territory like a prairie fire. It transformed the ghost from a mysterious, local threat into something far more terrifying, a figure from the violent, legendary past, a contemporary of men like Luke Dawson, whose name still carried the weight of myth. The Blackwood gang, who saw themselves as the new wolves of the territory, were now being hunted by what they could only assume was an old, and far more dangerous, predator. This new, legendary status had a profound and unintended effect within Redemption itself. The townspeople, who had been living in a state of cowed fear, began to see a glimmer of something they hadn't felt in a long time, a fighting chance. The ghost was not just killing their oppressors, she was a symbol of a wilder, older form of justice, a justice that had existed before men like Blackwood had tamed the land with fear. The first to act was Mr. Gable, the blacksmith. He was a man of quiet strength, whose defiance in the face of Blackwood's initial threats had been the catalyst for Clara's own intervention. He had watched her transform from a quiet trail guide into the town's avenging angel, and his gratitude had been simmering into a hard, defiant resolve. He sought her out, a dangerous journey into the hills, following a set of cryptic directions left for him by the stable boy. He found her in her new camp, a small, defensible cave hidden behind a waterfall of scree. He did not come with pleas or thanks. He came with an offering. "You're using store-bought cartridges," he said, his voice a low rumble, after a long, praising silence. He held out a heavy canvas bag. "These are better. Hand-loaded. A little more powder. A softer lead for a wider wound. It's what your husband used to prefer." Clara stared at him, then at the bag. The mention of Luke was a shock, a quiet intimacy that breached her carefully constructed walls. Gable was not just offering ammunition, he was offering a piece of her past, an acknowledgement of who she was. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I've been a blacksmith in this territory for 30 years, Mrs. Dawson," Gable said, using her real name for the first time. "I've shot horses for saints and sinners. I remember the knot, and I remember the man who taught it to you. He was a hard man, but he had a code. He never would have stood for what Blackwood is doing to this town." It was a pivotal moment. For 5 years, Clara had been utterly alone, trusting no one, her identity a secret she guarded with her life. Now, this quiet, decent man was offering not just his help, but his trust. He was offering an alliance. "My fight is not the town's fight," she said, her voice laced with the caution that had kept her alive. "You made it our fight the moment you stood up for my daughter," Gable countered, his gaze unwavering. "Let us help. We are not gunfighters, but we have eyes and ears. We know the gang's routines. We can be your shield, while you be our sword." Clara accepted. It was a risk, but she knew she could not win this war alone. Gable became her anchor in the town, a reliable source of supplies and, more importantly, information. He organized a small, secret network of resistance. Finn, the stable boy, became her scout, tracking the gang's movements. Old Man Hemlock, the general store owner, would leave messages for her in the form of coded supply orders. Her second ally came in the form of Dr. Elias Vance, the town's elderly, retired physician. He was a man who had known her and Alistair in a former life, before they had sought the anonymity of redemption. He had recognized the widow's nod immediately, and it had confirmed the suspicion he had held since Clay first arrived in town. He found her camp, not to offer help, but to treat the festering wound on her arm from a ricochet in the fight with Lefty Pete. "You can't save a town if you're dead from blood poisoning, Clara," he said, his voice a gentle, paternal chiding as he cleaned the wound with whiskey and a steady hand. "Luke was always the flashy one. You were always the smart one. Start acting like it." His cabin became her infirmary, a quiet, safe place to recover, to patch her wounds, to find a fleeting moment of peace in the midst of her war. He, Gable, and Finn became her counsel, a small and likely rebellion forged in the fire of shared desperation. For the first time since Luke's death, Clara was not just a ghost. She was a leader. Jed Blackwood was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. His gang was terrified, his second-in-command was dead, and the town he had so easily conquered was now actively working against him, a silent, hydra-headed rebellion he couldn't stamp out. His authority was a joke, his grand plans of controlling the valley for his railroad employer in tatters. He was a wolf being hunted in his own territory, and he was desperate. In his desperation, he made a fatal, arrogant decision. He decided to call in a bigger wolf. He had once ridden with a loose affiliation of outlaws run by the most powerful and feared man in the territory's underworld, a man whose reputation for ruthless cunning was second to none, Silas the Viper Kane. Blackwood, believing he could impress Kane and perhaps forge a more permanent, profitable alliance, sent a rider with a message. The message was a plea for assistance, an invitation to join in the easy pickings of the valley, and a boastful, foolish mention of the ghost who was haunting him, a ghost who used an old-fashioned widow's knot. The rider returned a week later, but not with the reinforcements Blackwood had expected. He came with a single man. This man was not a rough-hewn outlaw. He was dressed in a fine, black city suit, his boots polished, a pearl-handled revolver worn high on his hip like a gentleman. His face was sharp, intelligent, and held a look of cold, reptilian amusement. His name was Reno. Clara, watching from a high ridge as the man rode into town, felt a jolt of ice water shoot through her veins. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She recognized him instantly. The fine suit and the polished boots couldn't disguise the face she saw in her nightmares. He was one of Kane's inner circle. He had been there, in the Box Canyon, on the day Luke was murdered. He had been the one who had held the torch, his face illuminated by the flames, a cold, satisfied smirk on his lips. Her carefully planned, localized war for the soul of redemption had just collided with the ghosts of her own personal apocalypse. This was no longer just about Blackwood. Silas Kane, the architect of her ruin, the man she had planned to hunt one day in a distant, future reckoning, had just sent a piece of her past directly to her doorstep. The situation escalated with a terrifying speed. Reno was not a clumsy brute like Blackwood. He was a true viper, a man who saw everything. He spent his first day in town simply observing, his cold, intelligent eyes taking in the sullen defiance of the townspeople, the nervous incompetence of Blackwood's men, and the strange, tense atmosphere of the town. The confrontation happened that evening in the saloon. Clara, knowing she could not afford to hide, that to do so would be an admission of fear, walked into the saloon to meet with Gable. Reno was sitting at a corner table, nursing a whiskey. As Clara walked past, his eyes narrowed. He had only seen her briefly, 5 years ago, a frantic, smoke-stained woman scrambling into a ravine. But something in her walk, and the cold, pale stillness of her eyes, triggered a flicker of recognition. He saw not the dusty trail guide Clay. He saw the ghost of the outlaw widow. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. He stood up, blocking her path. "Well, well," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous purr that cut through the noise of the saloon. "Look what the dessert coughed up." He turned to a confused and angry Jed Blackwood. "You've been hunting a ghost, you fool. This is no ghost." He turned his full attention back to Clara, his smile widening. "This is Clara Dawson." The name dropped into the stunned silence of the saloon like a lit stick of dynamite. The townspeople who knew her only as Clay stared, bewildered. Blackwood's men looked on in confusion. But Mr. Gable and Dr. Vance, who were in the room, went pale. The secret was out. The ghost had been given a name, a history, and a price on her head. The ticking time bomb of Clara's past had just exploded, and the fight for redemption was now inextricably linked to a much older, and far more deadly, war. The Viper's shadow had fallen over the town, and Clara knew she had to get to Reno before he could send word back to his master, before Silas Kane could bring his full, terrifying power down on them all. The name Clara Dawson hung in the saloon air, heavy and dangerous as a loaded gun. For a moment, the world stood still. Jed Blackwood stared, his piggish eyes wide with a dawning, greedy realization. The ghost haunting him wasn't just some local tough, she was a wanted fugitive with a price on her head. The townspeople looked on in stunned confusion, their quiet trail guide suddenly unmasked as a figure of territory-wide notoriety. But in that frozen moment, Clara did not panic. The years of survival had forged her fear into a tool. She met Reno's triumphant, reptilian gaze with a cold, unreadable calm. "You've been spending too much time in the sun, stranger," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Clay." She did not wait for a response. In the instant of confusion her denial created, she acted. She kicked a nearby spittoon, sending it skittering across the floor toward Blackwood's men, a small, insignificant diversion. But it was enough. As heads turned, she moved, not with the aggression of a gunfighter, but with the swift, evasive grace of a prey animal. She was out the swinging doors and into the darkness before anyone could fully react. The hunt was on, but it was no longer a game of shadows and whispers. It was a race against time. Clara knew Reno would send a rider to Silas Kane by morning. Once Kane knew for certain she was alive, he would not just send a team of assassins, he would send an army. He would burn redemption to the ground to ensure his secrets remained buried with her. She had to get to Reno. She had to silence him for good. Her allies, Gable and Dr. Vance, found her at a prearranged safe house, a dusty, abandoned line shack on the edge of town. The fear in their eyes was palpable. "It's over, Clara," the doctor said, his voice grim. "You have to run. The name Dawson, it brings a different kind of trouble. The marshals will come." "I'm not afraid of the marshals," Clara said, her voice a low, intense whisper as she cleaned her colt. "They're just men. Kane is a devil. If word gets back to him, he will wipe this town and everyone in it from the map. I'm not running. Not this time." Her resolve was absolute. This was no longer just about saving the town, it was about ending the war that had started in that box canyon 5 years ago. The plan she devised was audacious and dangerous. She knew Reno was not a brute like Blackwood. He was a creature of intellect and ego. A simple ambush wouldn't work. She had to lure him into a trap of his own making, a place where she could control the narrative. With Gable's help, a message was sent to Reno. It was from the town elders, a fiction created for the occasion. The message was a plea of surrender. It said the townspeople were terrified of the Blackwood gang and of the newly revealed outlaw widow in their midst. They wanted to make a deal. They would help Reno capture Clara Dawson in exchange for a guarantee of peace and a share of the reward. The meeting place they proposed was the one place of supposed neutrality in the town, the church. It was a perfect lure for a man like Reno. It appealed to his arrogance, his belief that he could manipulate these simple townsfolk. He saw it as a chance to be a hero, to single-handedly capture the legendary widow and win the ultimate favor of Silas Kane. He agreed to the meeting, stipulating that he would come alone to show good faith. That night, the small adobe church was a stage set for a final confession. Gable and a few other trusted townspeople waited outside, a silent and seen ring of support. Inside, the church was lit by a single lantern, casting long, distorted shadows. Clara waited in the pews, not as a gunslinger, but as a ghost. Reno entered, confident and smiling, his pearl-handled revolver held loosely at his side. "A wise decision," he said, his voice echoing in the holy silence. "Now, where is she?" "She's right here, Reno," Clara's voice said. She stepped out from the shadows behind the altar, her own Colt leveled at his chest. "And there are no altars. There's only me." Reno's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then by a cold, calculating fury. He had been played. "A clever trick, Clara. But you're still just one woman. Cain will find you. He always finds everyone." "He won't have to," Clara said, her voice soft but laced with iron. "Because after tonight, I'm coming for him. But first, you're going to tell me why. Not the lies you told the marshals. The truth. Why did he betray Luke?" It became a battle of wills in the house of God. Reno, at first, was defiant, mocking her, sneering at Luke's memory. But Clara was relentless. She was no longer just a grieving widow, she was a confessor, armed with a gun and a righteous fury. She broke him down, not with physical violence, but with the sheer and blinking intensity of her gaze, with questions that chipped away at his composure. She asked him about the friendship, the shared rides, the promises of brotherhood. She forced him to confront the ghost of the men he had helped murder. Finally, under the weight of his own guilt and the cold, unwavering certainty of the gun aimed at his heart, he confessed. The truth was as ugly and pathetic as she had always feared. It wasn't just about the money, the legendary stash from the train robbery. It was about jealousy. Silas Cain, the cunning viper, had lived his entire life in Luke Dawson's shadow. Luke had the reputation, the charisma, the loyalty of his men. Cain had only his ambition and his bitterness. He hadn't just wanted Luke's gold, he wanted his legend. He killed him to steal his life, to become the man he could never be on his own. He was a king, Reno whispered, the words of final, bitter admission. And Silas couldn't bear to be a prince. He also revealed the final, damning detail. Silas Cain was no longer a skulking outlaw. He had used Luke's blood money to reinvent himself. He was now a powerful, respectable shipping magnate in San Francisco, a pillar of society, his empire built on a foundation of betrayal and murder. The confession was complete. Clara now had the full, ugly truth. She had the name of her final target and his location. Reno had served his purpose. "Thank you, Reno," she said, her voice a chilling, soft whisper. "You've just bought your ticket to hell. Tell Luke I sent you." The shot was a single, deafening clap of thunder in the sacred space. Reno fell, his confession silenced forever. Clara stood in the ringing silence, the smoke from her gun a prayer to a God she no longer believed in. She had secured her secret. She had the truth. But she also knew that by killing Cain's lieutenant, she had lit a fuse that stretched all the way to San Francisco. The Viper's shadow was no longer just a memory. It was a storm, gathering on the horizon. The discovery of Reno's body in the church sent Jed Blackwood into a spiral of panicked rage. His powerful potential ally was dead, and he was left alone to deal with the ghost that was dismantling his operation. His authority was gone, his men were on the verge of mutiny, and the townspeople were now looking at him not with fear, but with a cold, simmering defiance. Stripped of his cunning and his confidence, Blackwood reverted to what he was at his core, a blunt instrument of violence. If he could not control the town with fear, he would simply crush it. He declared a siege. He and his remaining dozen men set up a crude but effective blockade on the single road leading into and out of Redemption. They stopped the weekly supply wagon, sending it back with a volley of warning shots. They cut the town off from the outside world, from food, from ammunition, from hope. His plan was simple and brutal. He would starve them out. He would make the townspeople so desperate that they would turn on their ghostly protector themselves, that they would drag Clara Dawson out and hand her over in exchange for a sack of flour. The first few days of the siege were a grim test of the town's newfound resolve. Supplies dwindled. The water from Clara's hidden spring was enough to drink, but it couldn't feed the children. The mood in the town grew tense and desperate. Doubt began to creep in. Clara, watching from the hills, knew that this was the ultimate test for her and for the town. She could easily slip away, disappear back into the desert that had been her sanctuary for 5 years. But to do so would be to abandon the people who had put their faith in her, to betray the memory of the man her husband had been. She would not run. This was no longer a war of shadows and ghosts. This was a war of logistics and survival. She became the town's lifeline. Her intimate knowledge of the desert became their most valuable asset. She was no longer just a gunfighter, she was a provider. She used her hunting skills to bring in fresh meat, deer and jackrabbits, slipping past Blackwood's patrols in the dead of night to leave the carcasses at Gable's smithy. Her most daring move was to lead a series of raids against Blackwood's own camp. She was a phantom, striking at their weak points. She would sneak into their camp at night, not to kill, but to steal. She would make off with sacks of flour, with sides of bacon, with crates of ammunition, all of which were funneled back into the desperate town. These raids were incredibly dangerous, each one a razor's edge between success and death, but they served a dual purpose. They supplied the town, and they further demoralized Blackwood's men, who now felt as besieged as the people they were trying to starve. The townspeople, for their part, became an army of silent saboteurs. Their small acts of defiance became bolder. Gable would mistakenly sell Blackwood's men horseshoes made of brittle iron, causing them to break on the rocky trails. The doctor would concoct remedies for the gang's various ailments that had unpleasant and debilitating side effects. They were fighting a war of 1,000 cuts, their courage fueled by the knowledge that their ghost was out there, fighting for them. The siege culminated in Clara's most audacious plan yet. She learned from Finn that Blackwood kept the bulk of his gang's horse, their most valuable asset, in a temporary corral a mile down the road. An idea, born of Luke's own brand of theatrical, high-stakes outlawry, took root in her mind. On a moonless, windy night, Clara and a small, hand-picked team, Gable, armed with a heavy smithing hammer, and Finn, with his youthful agility, crept toward the corral. The two guards were lazy and complacent, huddled around a fire against the wind. The raid was a masterpiece of silent coordination. Clara and Gable took out the guards with swift, non-lethal efficiency, leaving them bound and gagged. Then, they simply opened the gate. With a series of whoops and cries, they stampeded the entire herd of horses. But they didn't drive them into the wilderness. In a move of pure, brazen audacity, they drove the thundering herd of panicked horses right down the main street of Redemption. The chaos was absolute. The sound of dozens of galloping horses was like thunder. Blackwood and his men, roused from their sleep, stumbled out of the saloon into a scene of utter pandemonium. They were scattered, confused, and helpless as their own wealth and mobility literally galloped past them and disappeared into the desert on the other side of town. The horse stampede was the final, breaking blow. In one swift, brilliant maneuver, Clara had not only resupplied the town with a dozen fresh mounts but had also utterly crippled the Blackwood gang, leaving them afoot, demoralized, and defeated. The siege was broken. The town had not just survived, they had won. And Clara Dawson, the outlaw widow, had proven that she was not just a ghost of vengeance, but a leader of formidable, unconventional genius. News of the broken siege and the death of his lieutenant, Reno, traveled slowly, but it eventually reached the pristine, mahogany-paneled offices of Silas Kane in San Francisco. Kane, who now moved in the rarefied air of city financiers and politicians, had built his empire on the meticulous burial of his past. The news that Clara Dawson, a ghost he had believed long faded into a wanted poster, was not only alive but was dismantling his territorial operations was not just an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. A man in his position could not afford to have the ghosts of his bloody past resurfacing. Kane's response was not the blustering, panicked rage of a man like Jed Blackwood. It was the cold, silent, and infinitely more dangerous response of a true viper. He did not send a gang. He did not send a message. He dispatched his personal instruments of correction. They arrived in the territory not as a posse, but as a pestilence. There were 3 of them, and they came to Redemption not on horseback, but on the morning stagecoach, dressed as respectable gentlemen. One looked like a bookkeeper, with a thin mustache and spectacles. Another could have been a traveling preacher, with a somber suit and a hollow-cheeked face. The third was a handsome, well-dressed dandy. They were quiet, methodical, and they moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose. They were Kane's elite assassins, city-bred killers who preferred the stiletto to the shotgun and poison to the pistol. Their names were unknown, but their mission was simple and absolute: erase the town of Redemption and the outlaw widow from the map forever. The arrival of these men shifted the nature of the war entirely. Clara had learned how to fight brutes like the Blackwood gang. She understood their motivations, their weaknesses. These men were different. They were professionals. They did not swagger or boast. They began a quiet, systematic infiltration of the town. They asked polite questions, they observed, and they began to identify the key members of the town's small rebellion. Clara, watching from the hills, felt a cold dread she had not felt before. These were not wolves she could outsmart in the canyons. These were spiders, and they were beginning to weave a web around the entire town. She now found herself fighting a war on two fronts. In front of her were the disorganized, demoralized, but still dangerous remnants of the Blackwood gang, licking their wounds and plotting a clumsy revenge. And now, moving silently within the town itself, were the Viper's fangs, professional killers who were hunting not just her, but her allies as well. The assassin's first move was an act of terrifying precision. They did not target Gable or the doctor, they targeted the weakest link. They found Finn, the stable boy, alone in the livery at night. They did not beat him. They did not torture him in a way that would leave marks. The preacher-like assassin simply spoke to him, his voice a soft, hypnotic whisper, describing in calm, clinical detail the slow, painful deaths his friends and family would suffer if he did not cooperate. They turned the boy's loyalty into a weapon against him. Finn, terrified beyond measure, broke. He revealed Clara's general location in the hills and the name of her next likely target, Jed Blackwood himself. Clara, unaware of this betrayal, was already planning her final move against Blackwood. But as she scouted his camp, her instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed at her that something was wrong. The guards were relaxed. The camp felt staged. She realized, with a sickening lurch in her stomach, that she was not the hunter anymore. She was the prey, and she was walking into a trap far more sophisticated than any she had ever set. The war for redemption had just entered its deadliest phase. Clara knew she was caught between two converging jaws of a deadly vice. Blackwood's gang was the obvious, brutal threat. Kane's assassins were the hidden, surgical one. To fight them both at once was suicide. Her only option was to make them destroy each other. Her mind, now a cold, calculating machine of strategy, formulated the most audacious gamble of her life. She needed to create a scenario so irresistible that it would draw both her enemies to the same place at the same time, a place where their mutual greed and suspicion would do her work for her. The bait had to be legendary. It had to be Luke Dawson's hidden gold. The story of Luke's final, massive Scoria Union payroll that had vanished without a trace was a cornerstone of outlaw mythology. Clara was the only person alive who knew the truth. There was no stash. Luke had used the last of the money to help settlers fight off railroad barons, a final act of rebellion he had never taken credit for. But the legend was more powerful than the truth. Through a now terrified Finn, she leaked information to Blackwood. The message was that she was finally going to retrieve her husband's gold. She was to meet a contact from her old gang at a neutral, remote location, the abandoned mission at a place called Diablo's Crossroads. Simultaneously, she sent a different message to Kane's assassins via an anonymous note left at the hotel. This message, seemingly from a disgruntled Blackwood gang member, revealed that their boss was planning to double-cross Kane. Blackwood was going to seize the legendary Dawson gold for himself and use it to build an army that would challenge Kane's dominance in the territory. The trap was set. Both parties took the bait, each believing they were walking into a situation they could control. Blackwood saw a chance to finally get his hands on a fortune. The assassins saw a chance to eliminate a potential rival and a troublesome ghost in one fell swoop. Diablo's Crossroads was a perfect stage for the final act. The crumbling adobe walls of the old mission provided a labyrinth of cover and ambush points. It was a place where alliances would be meaningless, and only the fastest and most ruthless would survive. Clara did not go alone. This was no longer her solitary war. Gable, his blacksmith's hammer in his belt and a shotgun in his hands, and Dr. Vance, his old medical bag now filled with extra ammunition alongside his bandages, insisted on coming. They were not gunfighters, but they would not let her face the devil alone. They, along with a handful of other grimly determined townspeople, were her small, desperate army. The chapter became a massive, chaotic, three-way firefight. The battle erupted as soon as the Blackwood gang and Kane's assassins arrived at the mission, their mutual suspicion and greed immediately boiling over into violence. Clara and her allies were not a third army, they were a catalyst. They used their knowledge of the mission's layout to harass both sides, to create crossfires, to ensure that neither gang could gain the upper hand. A shot from Gable's shotgun from the choir loft would send a group of assassins scattering into the path of Blackwood's men. A well-placed stick of dynamite from Clara would collapse a wall, separating the leaders from their men. It was a symphony of chaos, and Clara was its conductor. She moved through the battle, a phantom in the dust and smoke, her twin Colts a blur. She was not just a survivor anymore, she was a warrior, a leader, protecting her people while systematically dismantling her enemies. In the heart of the maelstrom, she finally came face to face with Jed Blackwood. Their final duel was not a classic high noon showdown. It was a desperate, brutal, close-quarters brawl in the ruins of the mission's nave. It was a fight of pure, animalistic grit. Blackwood was stronger, but Clara was faster, smarter, and fueled by a purpose that went far beyond mere survival. She used the environment, the crumbling pillars, the broken fuse, to her advantage. The fight ended with both of them battered, bleeding, and out of bullets. It came down to a knife. Blackwood lunged, and Clara, using a move Luke had taught her, used his own momentum against him. The fight ended with his own blade buried in his chest. As Blackwood fell, the back of his gang was broken. The few remaining members, seeing their leader dead, broke and fled, only to be picked off by Kane's more professional killers. The dust settled over Diablo's crossroads to reveal a scene of utter carnage. The Blackwood gang was annihilated. But the battle was not over. The three assassins, methodical and unshaken, now turned their full, cold attention on the last remaining targets, Clara and her small band of allies. The final fight was a desperate, running battle through the mission ruins. Kane's men were professionals, moving with a deadly, coordinated precision. But Clara and her allies had something the assassins did not. They were fighting for their homes, for their lives, for each other. Gable's raw strength, the doctor's surprising knowledge of tactics from his time in the army, and Clara's own lethal skill combined to form an unlikely but effective fighting force. One by one, the assassins fell, their city-bred skills no match for the desperate, cornered courage of the people of Redemption. The final assassin, the preacher-like man, cornered Clara in the bell tower. He was fast, and his pearl-handled revolver was almost a blur, but Clara's will was stronger. Her final shot echoed out over the silent, bloody battlefield. The threat to Redemption was over. In the aftermath, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, the small group of survivors stood under the vast, indifferent New Mexico sky. The town was free. They had won. The townspeople, led by Gable and the doctor, looked to Clara. They saw not a fugitive or an outlaw, but their savior, their protector. They asked her to stay, to be their leader, to help them build the new, free community they had all fought for. But Clara, looking at their hopeful faces, knew that her journey was not over. She had won the battle for redemption, but her personal war, the one that had started this all, still had one final chapter. The wanted posters with her name were still out there, and Silas Kane, the man who had created them, still sat in his pristine office in San Francisco, believing himself to be untouchable. The final scene of the story is not a celebration, but a quiet, solemn farewell. Clara shares a drink with her allies in the ruins of the mission, a silent toast to their shared victory and their fallen friends. She thanks them, not with words, but with a look of profound, heartfelt gratitude. Redemption is yours now, she tells them. Build it into something worthy of the price that was paid for it. She does not ride back to town. Her path leads west. She leaves them not as the fugitive Clay, but as Clara Dawson, a woman who has cleared her husband's name in the eyes of those who mattered and has reclaimed her own purpose in the process. She is no longer running from her past. She is riding toward a final, necessary reckoning. The story ends as she mounts her horse and looks toward the setting sun. Her last trail, the one that leads to the coast, to the viper in his city nest, has just begun. She is no longer the outlaw widow. She is justice. And she is coming for Silas Kane.